and I'm the manager. No problem. I'm the manager here at Family Services of the counseling program. This morning, Family Services, in partnership with Jennifer White, are excited to welcome you to our series of seminars, Coffee with Colleagues. Today's seminar will be on trust-based relational intervention. We want to acknowledge that we are joining you from the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, comprised of the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. If you do have any questions throughout today's seminar, please feel free to add them into the chat. We will be monitoring. As you've seen, today's session is recorded. I'd like to start by introducing Michelle. It's so nice to see you, Michelle. It's been a while. For those of you who don't know, Michelle is a registered clinical social worker with the Ontario College. She received her Master's of Social Work degree in 2006 from the University of Windsor, and she's the owner of Balanced Life Wellness Center in Essex. And I'm going to turn it over to Michelle.
Well, hello everyone. There's so many familiar faces and it has been too long. And a big shout out to all my old friends at Family Services. Hello Beth Ann, I miss you so much. I'm thrilled today to introduce Gayle Dulong. I got to know Gayle a few years ago when she started with us at Balanced Life Wellness Center. So I'm gonna read her intro and then let her get into telling us all about trust-based relational intervention, which I'm learning about today as well. So I'm just so excited, Gayle, that you're doing this today. So Gayle Dulong has been an employee of the Windsor-Essex Children's Aid Society for the past 27 years. Though she began her career in frontline child protection, she moved to the permanency department 22 years ago, where she has worked with kin, foster, and adoptive parents caring for children who have experienced complex developmental trauma. She's been a supervisor in this department for the past 12 years. 15 years ago, Gayle became a foster parent with the Chatham-Kent Children's Aid Society, and after having cared for a few children with histories of severe trauma, she began her own journey to learn about trauma, how this impacts children, and how caregivers can meet the needs of children from hard places. Being in the trenches, caring for children with histories of trauma has been the best life experience, both personally and professionally. In 2019, Gayle joined our team of practitioners at Balanced Life Wellness Center here in Essex in order to work alongside families parenting children who've experienced trauma or with families simply struggling in their parenting journey. Though Gayle began learning about the TBRI approach in 2018 and has been educating and training kin, foster, and adoptive parents in this approach for the past 2 years, she only recently became a TBRI practitioner in May of this year. Gayle is currently working closely with Karen Purvis Institute of Child Development in Texas as they continue to support her in her role at Children's Aid in bringing trauma-informed care to the organization as well as in her own practice. Gayle is also involved on a provincial committee currently researching the best approaches in working with families and children with histories of trauma. Gayle's hope is that the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies will adopt TBRI as the approach to use in working with all families and children involved with CAS across the province. Gayle is also hopeful that someday our entire community will embrace the TBRI approach so that we can all use a consistent trauma-informed and evidence-based approach when working with our families to achieve better outcomes. Gayle is thrilled to be here today with all of you to share the TBRI approach with you. So welcome, Gayle.
Thank you, Michelle. Thanks so much for having me today. I'm very excited to join everyone so that we can learn more about TBRI together. All right, so we're going to get started. I just wanted to note that at the end of the presentation, there will be lots of an opportunity to answer any questions that anyone has about TBRI. So we're going to go through the presentation, which is about 45 minutes, and then time afterwards for questions. Prior to beginning, I did just want to note that for those of you who have been in the field for many years and are likely familiar with a host of other approaches, such as Circle of Security and Triple P parenting, collaborative problem solving, the 357 model or sanctuary model, among many others. All of these approaches certainly have strengths and benefits. However, I believe that TBRI is the only caregiver model which includes parents and professionals and provides a holistic, evidence-based, and trauma-informed approach to meeting the needs of children and families, both individually, but also organizationally. All right, so we're going to get started. All right, so as Michelle mentioned, just this past May, I did become a TBRI practitioner. So I'm excited to work with families in my private practice, as well as in my role at CAS, where I will be training our staff moving forward this fall. Okay, so where it all began. The TBRI model was developed by the late Dr. Karen Purvis and Dr. David Cross in 1999. It's best described in 3 phases. So the first phase of TBRI began in 1999 to 2005, and that's where the TBRI model was developed. They also wrote the book, The Connected Child, and produced a video series called the Healing Family series. And they established the Karen Purvis Institute of Child Development at Texas Christian University. When they moved to phase 2 in 2005 to 2015, their main focus at that point was the development of the practitioner training, the reference manual, which is given to all practitioners during their training, as well as they also have the instructor workbook and participant workbook to go with that training. Ongoing research and publication of scholarly journal articles, as well as the Hope Connection Camp for children who have been adopted, but who all have histories of trauma and loss. And also their partnership with Show Hope. And their partnership with Show Hope is really about educating others about TBRI through what was formerly known as the Empowered to Connect conferences. So some of you may have participated in that, in those in the last 10 years or so. And recently this past year, it was retitled Hope for the Journey. So we are currently in phase 3, which is from 2015 to the present time, and that is the implementation of TBRI in various settings. And so we're going to get into that in a little bit. They also created the documentary All Rise for the Good of the Children, and I can't say enough about this documentary. You can Google it, and you will find it either on YouTube or on the Karen Purvis Institute Facebook site. It's about an hour and a half in length, and it really shows how when a community comes together using the same consistent approach with families, and one that is trauma informed and attachment based, that we can really, really see great outcomes for our families and children. And it's very exciting, and has created a lot of passion in me for having a vision to look at how we can do things differently in our community. Of course, starting in child welfare and moving that out to all of our mental health settings and practitioners and juvenile justice, the school system, and so forth. And also during this time, the goal of the Institute is to partner with 25 states and in 25 different countries. So currently TBRI is actually in 50 states right now. And the state of Texas, which is where the model was created, is fully TBRI'd, which means they are using this approach in all settings and in all services for in the community, in the entire state. So when we think of our own situation here in Ontario, I'm one of 5 practitioners in Ontario, and there are several other TBRI practitioners in Manitoba and as well as British Columbia. The mission and vision of the Karen Purvis Institute of Child Development is to bring hope and healing to children from hard places. They strive to help children suffering from the effects of early trauma, abuse, and neglect, and they conduct research to deepen understanding about the complex needs of these children and how to help them overcome social, behavioral, and emotional challenges. Dr. Cross was himself a child in the foster care system, and Dr. Purvis was a foster parent for many years before returning to school to complete her graduate work and eventually co-create TBRI. Many of the staff are adopted parents or have fostered themselves or worked in group home settings for many years. They bring years of personal and professional experience from the trenches. The KIPCD training specialists are some of the most amazing trainers and professionals that I have worked with in my 27 years in practice. When we look at the TBRI model, it is an attachment-based trauma-informed intervention that is designed to meet the complex needs of vulnerable children. The intervention, as I mentioned, is based on years of attachment, but also sensory processing and neuroscience research, though the heartbeat of TBRI is connection. TBRI has successfully been implemented in a wide variety of professional and caregiving settings, including adoptive and foster and kin families, residential care, child welfare, juvenile justice, family courts, schools, and mental health settings. Currently, TBRI is being piloted in an early childhood home visiting program throughout the state of Texas, as well as a few other states, to see how this model, this approach will work with birth families. So I'm very excited to also hear of that. It is one of my hopes as a supervisor at the Windsor-Essex Children's Aid Society is that we can bring this approach to working with our birth families and hopefully prevent children from having to come into the foster care system. TBRI is used with children and youth of all ages and all risk levels. It is effective with children of all developmental levels, including those with significant developmental delays and diagnosis of autism. By applying the TBRI principles, it helps children return to their natural developmental trajectory. And I've seen the success with our foster and adoptive homes over the past 2.5 years. TBRI is the only caregiver model currently being used in the field, which has more than 20 years of research behind it and is designed to be used with children from birth right through to their 20s. Okay, so before we delve into a little bit more about the model, I did just want to review the definition of trauma and to make sure that we all have a similar understanding of what trauma is. It's important to understand this and to realize that trauma is defined as a psychological emotional response to an event or an experience that is deeply distressing. So that certainly includes complex developmental trauma and diagnosis of PTSD. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, Medical Director of the Trauma Center in Boston, Professor as well of Psychiatry at Boston University, and co-director of the National Center for Child Traumatic Stress Complex Trauma Network, is a pioneer in the field of trauma. And he defines trauma as specifically an event that overwhelms the central nervous system, altering the way that we process and recall memories. Trauma is not the story of something that happened back then, but it's the current imprint of that pain and horror and fear living inside of people. Dr. Gabor Madi, another expert in the field and who I'm really enjoying learning under in his training series, The Wisdom of Trauma, states that trauma is not what happened to you, but what happened inside of you as a result of the trauma. A disconnection from the self because the pain is too much to handle, which results in many forms of unacceptable social behaviors. So now we're going to watch a short video that does a great job of explaining the TBRI video, or the TBRI approach, sorry, in a very succinct animated video.
TBRI, Trust-Based Relational Intervention, has at its core building a trusting relationship. It has 3 sets of principles, and they look at the child as a whole. When you think about development, the baby cries, and I say, yes, I will comfort you. And so this child learns that they have a voice, They learn trust, which is the lesson of the first year of life. I can trust. There are so many children from hard places, and for those children, their capacity to trust has been fiercely damaged. The brain chemistry of a child who cries and no one comes is dramatically altered. The child with a history of trauma or loss or abuse has no hope of healing without a nurturing relationship. In every way that I make time and space, that I give touch, eye contact, and I give words, I am going to empower this child to go back to the beginning of what he or she should have experienced in the arms of a loving parent that said, when you cry, I will come. The phenomenal thing about a trust-based intervention is, as we connect to this child, as we build safety, we actually change the brain chemistry. We change the wiring of the brain. This is really the heart and soul of all that we are and all that we do. Do I look into the child's eyes? Do I touch their arm when I talk to them? When they talk to me, do I stop what I'm doing and talk to them? This is the essence of mindfulness. The excitatory chemicals about I'm afraid, I'm hungry, I'm cold, those are balanced when the caregiver comes and gives warmth. All regulation occurs first with an external regulator. So in the beginning, I regulate all. They're cold, I bring warmth. They're crying, I bring myself. And out of my regulation, their brain develops capacity for self-regulation. If this child didn't have this experience, that child doesn't feel safe. This chemistry can be altered, first by knowing they're safe, second by nutrient-rich foods, third by my environmental regulation of that child's emotion, and fourth by appropriate exercise. So we can balance brain chemistry by creating a holistic environment. We clearly have to deal with behavior. Correcting means showing a child the right behavior, praising him when he gets it, and showing it to him until he can get it right, and showing him with no fear and no shame, so that he builds success, not a greater sense of failure. So the message of hope for our families is that we can help our children to dramatic levels of healing. We simply have to be devoted to it and be willing to invest what it's going to take.
Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that quick little animated video. It is one of my favorites. There are several that the Institute does have, but it does show just a really nice, succinct way of what the approach entails. And today is certainly just an overview, and I'm going to get into a little bit more of those details now. So in order to understand TBRI, it's important to understand the risks to development and what constitutes as complex developmental trauma. We know that brain growth begins in utero, and the fastest periods of brain growth are in utero, the first year of life, and then again at ages 5, 8, 12, and 16. Any prolonged periods of stress impacts how our brain is wired. A stressful pregnancy or lack of prenatal care impacts brain growth, as well as a difficult birth, and any early hospitalizations where the child is deprived of human touch. Abuse, neglect, and any form of trauma, as perceived by the child, also impacts brain growth and the wiring and firing of the brain. Research shows that a child impacted by abuse, neglect, or trauma have amygdalas which are often twice the size of other children due to their life experiences. The amygdala is the smoke detector part of the brain, which is always scanning the environment to make sure we are safe. The amygdala is hyperactivated by trauma. And this means that many of the children we work with are focused on keeping themselves safe rather than learning. It takes time and educated caregivers and professionals to understand how to meet the needs of these children and how to help create felt safety. Now we're going to watch another short video here.
Early trauma, in whatever form, can alter the way the brain develops and trigger changes in neurotransmitters that drive our central nervous system. Neurotransmitters are chemical messengers that tell our hearts to beat, our lungs to breathe, and our limbs to move. They also play a vital role in our moods, memory, even our ability to cope with stress. In children from hard places, key neurotransmitter systems can be altered in potentially harmful ways, causing behavior to spiral out of control.
When you finish,
And cripple a child's ability to learn and grow.
We know that if dopamine is too high or too low, we don't get good learning. I'm not dying. We don't get good memory. We don't get clear thinking.
help me, honey.
That's too hard.
It is hard.
Too high or too low. We get aggression, violence, acting out, thinking disorders, mood disorders, schizophrenic-like behaviors, autistic-like behaviors.
They have neurochemically their fingers in an electric socket. A child who has changes in his brain and his brain chemistry from early trauma won't just automatically heal. They need insightful, precise, skillful parenting.
May I have a hug? Oh, I love you.
They need to be parented more like a toddler or even an infant in terms of how we are kind of on them all the time or with them all the time.
Research has shown that children from hard places can be developmentally less than half their chronological age. So a child who's 8 may act more like a 3 or 4-year-old. A 6-year-old may act more like a 2.5 or 3-year-old.
One of the greatest gifts that I would give a parent if I had the capacity was the compassion that comes with deep insight. If I look at my child's behavior compassionately, I still have to deal with it, but I can deal with it properly because I realize where that behavior was coming from. I have never seen a child that couldn't come to dramatic levels of healing, but we have to know how to guide them.
Okay, so just a short video there to say a little bit more about the model and the importance of, it is founded in the research on the neuroscience of the brain, and it really teaches caregivers and professionals how to have a better understanding of why children have such behaviors. It talks a lot about different neurotransmitters, such as dopamine, and how we can increase that naturally as caregivers, ensuring children are eating protein-rich foods and exercising regularly, getting good sleep at night, and using meditation to help calm. Understanding the science behind the approach is critical for a deep understanding of this approach to occur. It also speaks a lot about increasing serotonin levels, which we know is so key to stabilizing mood. And of course, helping families to understand that we can hopefully provide children with foods that boost serotonin, such as nuts and seeds and turkey and chicken and pineapple and salmon and all kinds of other foods. But as we've heard so far, this approach is really holistic in nature. So we're looking at meeting all of the needs of the children. And so that it takes everything into consideration. Now, TBRI is based on 3 principles, and the empowering principles address physical needs, the connecting principles for attachment needs, and correcting principles to disarm fear-based behaviors. It is based on the idea that effective interventions must focus on the whole child, their behaviors, their emotions, their thoughts, relationships, ecology, and physiology. The TBRI model provides countless suggestions for staff and caregivers to address behaviors and meet the needs of the children entrusted in our care. Training of this consists of 4 modules at 6 hours each for a total of 24 hours of training. These modules can be delivered in a way that works best for each individual agency, and optimal learning will occur when participants have time to implement the knowledge and strategies in between the modules while also being supported in their learning. Refresher trainings and case consultations are also ideal in applying this approach to our practice. So in the fall at WECAS, we will be moving forward with beginning to look at training our staff in this model. And in my private practice, I'm currently using the TBRI training one-on-one with families. Because of COVID, I haven't been able to do any kind of large group community parenting classes, but I am using it one-on-one with many different families, two-parent families, blended families, and families who have adopted. And everyone that I've worked with has just shared, very openly about how this approach has changed their lives in such incredible ways. One of the other things that I will add is that being able to have offered this for the last 2.5 years to our foster and adoptive caregivers, I have heard over and over again from these families how this approach has really changed everything that they do as parents, and how they're looking at the needs of children through a completely different lens. Homes that were struggling with the children in their care are now experiencing joy and a newfound attachment to these children because they followed this model, this approach. And we've just seen such great success that I'm just really excited to be able to share it with others and hopefully keep moving things forward. All right, so now when we look at the TBRI principles, we see the pyramid before us. The TBRI principles model or approach, is illustrated in a pyramid to really focus on the importance of investing in the relationship and taking time to build that connection with the children that we work with or the children who are in our care. When the majority of our time is spent connecting and empowering children, then less time is required for correcting, as children will have fewer behaviors. The diagram also illustrates in the top pyramid how many parenting approaches focus on correcting rather than connecting, which creates an unstable foundation in the relationship. I often say that a traditional parenting model focuses on the pyramid at the top, which most of our time and energy is being focused on correcting the behavior rather than really connecting. And though this can sound simple, it's my experience that many, many parents struggle with devoting the time to truly connect to the children in their care. I can also share my own personal experience as a foster parent, having parented a little guy who came to me when he was around 4 years old. We made significant gains using a traditional positive parenting approach, but it was, we did not make those permanent lasting gains until I was able to completely connect with him. And that really came from my journey, my own personal journey, learning about trauma. The book Parenting the Hurt Child by Kekin Kupecki was really a game changer for me, and certainly eventually led me to TBRI. Once I was able to spend the time connecting, I spent less time correcting because the child felt more connected to me and was less fearful. And then eventually that feeling of felt safety was created. And so the behaviors just started to dissipate. And so my own personal experience was that this was certainly a game changer. And was something that I began sharing with our kin, foster, and adoptive parents, and have repeatedly been told over the last number of years how this has really changed their life as well. So relational trauma can affect children and youth and adults in a variety of ways. And here's how Dr. Purvis summarizes the effects of trauma. She talks about the 5 Bs of relational trauma: the brain, biology, body, behavior, and beliefs. Now, Dr. Purvis does reference the work of Dr. Bessel van der Kolk in his book, The Body Keeps the Score, which describes the neurodevelopmental impact of traumatic stress on the mind and body. And I have to say that the book, The Body Keeps the Score, has been a fantastic resource for myself, both in my role at Children's Aid, but also in my private practice. And cannot recommend that book enough to others if you have not already read it. So when we look at the brain, Relational trauma impacts the developing brain so that it's organized around the primitive survival mechanisms of fight, flight, and freeze, as opposed to our higher order processes that support learning, creativity, and healthy relationships. When we think of biology, through its impact on the brain, relational trauma impacts human biology through a variety of mechanisms, including the chronic activation of the HPA axis, suppression of the immune response, and alteration of epigenetic processes. The HPA axis is a term used to represent the interaction between the hypothalamus, the pituitary glands, and the adrenal glands, and plays an important role in the stress response. Now, when we think about the body, relational trauma impacts the body by altering our sensory experiences of the world and our experience of the body itself. Research shows that trauma is literally stored in the cells of our body. So when we think about behavior, and because of the adverse impact of relational trauma on fundamental neurodevelopmental and neurobehavioral processes, especially in regards to emotional, behavioral, and cognitive self-regulation, children that we work with are often given multiple diagnoses, including anxiety, depression, ODD, ADHD, PTSD, and reactive attachment disorder, now known as complex developmental trauma, when in fact, most of the behaviors are a result of unresolved trauma. So finally, when we look at beliefs, relational trauma profoundly impacts beliefs and dispositions about the self, which includes self-awareness, self-regulation, self-esteem, and self-efficacy. In the book, The Body Keeps the Score, Dr. van der Kolk refers to developmental trauma as the hidden epidemic and states the following: our brains are sculpted by our early experiences. Maltreatment is a chisel that shapes a brain to contend with strife, but at the cost of deep enduring wounds. Childhood abuse isn't something you get over. Though the trauma may be over, it keeps being replayed in continually recycling those memories and in a reorganized nervous system. In the children we work with, we see the unresolved trauma and many forms of behaviors. This approach challenges caregivers and professionals to look beyond the behaviors and see the unmet need, and it becomes our job to meet those needs. TBRI incorporates the 3 pillars of Traumawise care, which includes felt safety, connection, and self-regulation. Some of you may be familiar with the 3 pillars of Traumawise care, and is based on the 3 broad sets of developmental needs for survivors. First of all, the need for physical and psychological safety, the need for trust-based relationships that can heal and provide positive models for future relationships, and the need for guidance in developing the ability to self-regulate our emotions, our cognitions, and our behaviors. So now when we think of the implementation of TBRI, we are looking at 3 phases. Learning experiences have beginnings, middles, and endings, and everyone's journey is going to look different as they move forward with TBRI. But in the exploration phase, we look at how can TBRI meet the needs of the organization in which I work or with the individuals in which I work with. In the immersion phase, it means going deep with training and consultation so that a culture of trauma-informed care develops. And then in the extension phase, it involves training of additional community partners and consultation. And it is the hope of the Institute with adapting and using the TBRI model is that eventually others, those who are trained or are TBRI practitioners will be able to train others in the community. And so it just continues to branch out and grow. One of the wonderful things about becoming a TBRI practitioner is that the Institute continues to offer support after successful completion of the training and is available to answer any questions that your organization may have before or after implementation of this model. TBRI is flexible, and we're able to tweak the approach to meet the individual needs of our organization. The Institute does give permission for practitioners to train others outside of the organization, as long as you have the time to offer support and consultation to those whom you are training. All right, so let's look at now TBRI in action. And what does that look like for caregivers as well as staff? So we're going to start with the empowering practices. So based on the empowering principle is divided into two categories: ecological strategies and physiological strategies. So when we think about ecological strategies,
or 11 o'clock at night. And it's September.
We are looking at creating a safe environment with planned transitions. So transitions from one activity to the next. Rituals, which typically involve morning or bedtime rituals with children, and artifacts such as meaningful items to the child, which can include favorite blankets or stuffies or something that's important to them. Routine and structure, consistency and predictability, we know is important for all children, but especially for children with histories of abuse, loss, and trauma. We also use things such as, I will say too, felt safety is extremely important. The definition of felt safety is that the child feels safe. A lot of times the caregivers that I work with will say they've done everything in their environment to have the child feel safe, so they don't understand why the child wouldn't feel safe. But felt safety is really what the child feels internally. And for many children with significant histories of trauma and abuse, it can take quite a while and a lot of energy and time to create that environment and also that connection to help the child feel safe. So then when we look at the physiological strategies that are involved in empowering the children that we work with, it's the importance of preparing the body to maintain consistent blood sugar and the regulation of hormones and neurotransmitters. This includes understanding how prolonged periods of stress can increase cortisol levels and can have damaging effects on children, youth, and adults of all ages. It really speaks to different things that we can help our children with by providing, lots of physical activity. Rhythmic activity is so very important for the children that we work with and can include swinging, dancing, and music. And a sensory-rich milieu is also critical to meeting the needs of children. So this approach really focuses a lot on meeting the sensory needs of our children and can include using things such as fidgets for children to help stay focused during classroom time or learning time, as well as gum or mints to help children stay regulated while they're at school or in any kind of learning environment. They also use things such as weighted blankets or lap pads, weighted lap pads for children during the school day. They use things such as checking your engines with children, which is a term that is, or an activity that's borrowed from the ALERT program. And lots of time is really spent on just looking at all of the needs through a very holistic approach. So now we'll move on to the connecting practices. So when we look at connecting, we're looking at, again, it's divided into two types of strategies: mindfulness strategies and engagement strategies. The practice starts by having the caregiver examine their own history, which heavily influences the type of care given to the child. We know that without awareness, attachment style is formed at 12 months of age and carries throughout our life. Being fiercely honest about our past in order to let go with compassion is really important to be able to move forward and move towards an earned, secured attachment relationship with our children. Knowing our triggers is also key, and being aware of our children's triggers is key to building a connected relationship. Learning to act rather than react is essentially very key to this approach. Now, we also want to ensure that we always have a calm presence and we're flexible when we're responding to our children. Essentially, we will often be co-regulating the children in our care, or the children that we are working with. Warm and nurturing eye contact and body position is really key. Using a nurturing tone of voice with emphasis on specific words to help maintain things in a very positive way, and to help instill safety and not any kind of fear. So when we look at the second strategy of engagement strategies, this really involves using safe and healthy touch, which releases oxytocin and dopamine and reduces those stress chemicals that are often present in the children that we work with. So lots of hugs and high fives and holding hands and hands on shoulders, and just really kind of meaningful touch and contact, eye contact and voice quality, the tone that we use and the cadence that we use. So sometimes really it's very important to slow down our speech when we're speaking with children. They do tend to process things at a slower rate, especially if they're experiencing any fear. Now, some of that, of course, is going to be a little bit challenging because of COVID. So when we talk about touch, but there's lots of other ways around that. We can certainly do symbolic touch, or we can do different things such as, air fist pumps and different ways that we can just really try to connect with children. We can have fun nicknames with kids. We've often seen that in the teachers or group home workers that use the TBRI approach. So there are ways around the physical touch, which I know can be really challenging during the current pandemic. So then when we look at behavioral matching, this really conveys with our nonverbal body language, just a feeling of connection. So sitting in a similar way that the child is sitting, facing them, getting down on their eye level, not looking over the child, but being at the same level of eye contact. All of that creates safety and understanding because we're mirroring them and how we're sitting and choosing different things. So for example, you might be working with a child or playing with a child, and you just talk about how you really like the drawing that they're doing or the Lego structure that they're building, and wow, I think I'm going to build one just like you. And all of those kinds of things are involved in this approach, in the behavioral matching component of it. And then of course, when we look at playful engagement, I mean, play really is so important and so key to this approach. We know that play disarms fear, it builds trust, it builds social skills, and it really increases learning. So playful engagement is really, really key to this approach because it does disarm fear and build trust. So then we're moving to the next, the last principle of this model, which is the correcting practices. And again, divided into the two areas of proactive strategies and then responsive strategies. So when we're talking about the proactive strategies, you know, it's really important that that parents understand, as well as staff, that oftentimes it is, you know, we're going to have to emotionally regulate the children in our care, and it's really the parents' job to do that. And so important to be mindful and to remain calm so that we can, our children's regulation will come from our regulation. We certainly want to also encourage the positive, right? So wherever our child is at with respect to whatever the skills are that they need to learn, we want to make sure that we're meeting them where they're at, which is where developmentally they're at and not what chronologically where we think they should be. And so this includes a lot of scaffolding, which just includes providing them as much support as possible as they work towards achievement of whatever the skill is that we're working on. Under the proactive strategies, they also use what we call life value terms, and it's essentially short scripts. So this model really believes that the best way to teach values to children who have attention problems and language deficits is by using simple and brief language, keeping our messages short and sweet. They use a variety of stock phrases or scripts that are designed to communicate life values in very simple ways. And these life values can be switched up depending on the age of the children we're working with. They use the same thing in the camps that they do with teenagers, but they just change the language a little bit so that it's more appropriate for adolescents. But when we're looking at those life value terms, there are 6 key ones. And the first one is showing respect. So respect means not touching things, property, or people without permission. And knowing that the child needs to use respectful words and actions. And so that is one of the key life values. Asking permission is the second one, to reinforce the concept that your child needs to turn to safe adults for guidance. We use the phrase ask permission. Children from hard places often want to be in control of everything. So asking them to ask permission before they before they act helps break that cycle. Listen and obey is the third life value. And that is really teaching children that they don't have to scream or that parents don't have to scream or yell to gain their child's cooperation, but rather to calmly remind the child to listen and obey. Playing certain games like red light, green light, or Simon Says is really a fun way to introduce this concept to children and to help them adopt this concept. And when we're looking at the fourth life value term, which is gentle and kind, many at-risk children don't understand how to modulate their own behavior. So gentle and kind helps children develop empathy and respect for other creatures. It also heightens self-awareness so that they can better regulate their own behavior. The fifth life value is consequences. So children need to be introduced to the concept of consequences as part of their learning to make good choices. And by helping children understand the consequences of their impulses, they will begin to learn to self-regulate. The last life value term that we're going to talk about today, there are actually a few more, but these really are the main ones that TBRI focuses on, is called no hurts. So no hurts is just that. We don't hurt people with words or actions. And it's a short phrase, but it's very easy even for small children to understand, and really just echoes those other life values such as showing respect and being gentle. The thought is that by practicing these scripts with children consistently during calm and good times, that they'll work when we need them the most, which is usually in times of crisis. And we all know that if we're only using these strategies in times of crisis, the challenge then becomes that many times we tend to revert back to old ways of parenting or old ways of responding. And so the more that we can use this approach during the good times, the easier it will make things when we are in the middle of a crisis with one of our children. So the second part of the correcting practices is the responsive strategies. And so before I should say too, part of the proactive strategy is also shared power and choices. So again, I mean, that's very, this is very well known in many different approaches that you're probably familiar with, but TBRI focuses a lot on the shared power and allowing children to make choices, and also allowing children to ask for compromises and to negotiate their needs. And because this is a life skill that, if nurtured appropriately, becomes a really important life skill that our children will use for the remainder of their life in many different environments. So then we move on to the responsive strategies. So this model focuses a lot on redos, which are important to teach the child and the youth the right way of doing things. We know that repetition rewires the brain and creates body memory. So essentially, when a child does something incorrectly, the parent asks in a playful way for a redo. So if the child were to come home from school and come in through the door, slam the door, and then start demanding needs, the parent may say, oh, you know, whoa, Nellie, let's try that again. And let's go back out and come in through the door appropriately without slamming it. And then asking with our kind words rather than our demanding tone. And so by practicing this regularly with children, we're creating, you know, that body memory. The other wonderful thing about this is that parents get the redos as well. So when we make mistakes as parents, that we also get a redo, and it really becomes just a fun way of parents and children interacting with each other and knowing that we all have bad days and we're not always going to be perfect. And this model really focuses on good enough parenting, which is trying to get it right 70% of the time. We talked a little bit already about consequences. This approach does not believe in the use of a lot of imposed consequences, but certainly natural consequences and consequences that will happen, you know, sometimes in other environments such as school. It does focus on the ideal response, and it's just a short acronym that basically means, you know, I for immediate, to respond within seconds wherever possible when a child is acting out or is becoming dysregulated. D, meaning for direct, so to engage directly with the child with eye contact, proximity, and touch whenever possible. E stands for efficient, using a measured response that is equal in intensity to the challenge. And we're going to talk a little bit about that under levels of response in a minute. Action-based, so giving an opportunity for a redo, practicing the right way certainly creates that body memory for optimal behavior. And ensuring that our response is leveled at the behavior and never at the child. So that's really important to keep in mind. And then when we talk about the levels of response, we're talking about hopefully most of the time maintaining playful engagement. But this approach does teach the 4 levels, which is playful, structured, calming, and protective. And so I won't get into too much of that here, but in the training, it goes into great depth on what those levels of response are. And regardless if our response has to become more structured or we need to help calm and co-regulate the child, the goal really is always to return back to a playful engagement. This approach really encourages creative problem solving and repair. And it's important to know that when the relationship is ruptured or injured by the adult or the child apologizes and asks for a redo. The corrective practices are to teach and never to cause shame or embarrassment or humiliation in our children, as this can certainly cause psychological wounds. All right, so we're getting close to kind of wrapping up the presentation. So when we look at pulling it all together, we look at the fact that TBRI is effective because it is founded in research, in theory, and experience. Its effectiveness of TBRI has been studied in residential facilities, camp schools, and with at-risk adopted children and their parents. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, it's currently being piloted right now with birth families. The Institute has been involved in transforming cultures of care with TBRI for the past 14 years and continues to evaluate its effectiveness. Changing cultures of care is essential to providing families with the best services, and I believe TBRI assists with better outcomes for our families. So when we're looking just kind of in summary in terms of TBRI, TBRI does provide hope to all those caring for children from hard places. Some in the field have referred to TBRI as the antidote to the difficult work that we do. The TBRI mantra, which emphasizes seeing needs as a precursor to meeting those needs and placing all of this in the context of those enduring relationships. So in wrapping up for today, a few of the key points, which is why I love TBRI and I know it to be so effective, is that it really does help children feel safe, and it teaches caregivers to really look beyond the behavior and to meet those unmet needs. It helps parents co-regulate our children, which, you know, eventually children can then begin to self-regulate. It helps children understand and manage the overwhelming emotions that happen to all of them and all of us from time to time. It teaches caregivers to help children develop coping strategies. It also offers nurture groups and activities that can be used in both therapeutic settings, but also family settings. And I believe TBRI is the most comprehensive, holistic model available with practical tools, strategies, training, consultation sheets, and also evaluation tips that, you know, once you're trained as a practitioner, it helps you evaluate whether or not the approach is working within your organization. So I just want to thank everybody today who took the time out of their busy schedules to be here and to learn more about TBRI. I really hope that you found the presentation informative, and I'm available now for anyone who may have any questions or any feedback.
Well, thanks a lot, Gail. I do want to thank you for today's presentation. That was absolutely wonderful. I know I found it very informative and I did enjoy the videos. I think there is a message here. Let's just take a quick look. Sorry, Denise, I'm not sure what you're looking to clarify in the first video played. Did I miss the beginning of your message there? Oh, there was an image I would like to print, if that makes sense. So Steph, maybe you could handle those questions relative to the PowerPoint presentation.
And then I did notice Olivia had her hand up. So I'm not sure if Olivia, you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, I did. Thank you so much.
Hi, Olivia.
Hello, Gail. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Thank you for asking. I just wanted to come on camera, introduce myself. I'm Olivia, and I'm going into my 4th year of social work at the University of Windsor, same school you went to. And I wanted to take the time to thank you all for the presentation. It was so informative. I learned so much about approach and method that I've never really been completely introduced to, and learning about it and learning how effective and holistic it was made me wonder and want to ask you what the turning point for you was that made you realize that TBRI was completely different than the other methods, and why you had to become a practitioner in this approach and had to go out and implement it to the world. I want to know what the turning point kind of was for you and when you kind of realized, if there was a moment.
Well, thank you for those kind words and for those questions. Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned a little bit earlier, for me, the turning point was as a foster parent in the trenches. You know, I've been in some format teaching parenting classes even before I graduated with my undergrad in university. And so when I became a foster parent, I thought, you know, I've got this. I have older birth children. I'm educated. I understand child development fairly well. But what became really apparent to me is I didn't have a very deep understanding of trauma and how this impacts development. And so after the first children who were in my care, we cared for twins for a period of a year. And then I went back and to the university and got my master's. Then after I graduated with my master's, became a foster parent again to a little boy who was 4 and had a lot of behaviors and a lot of anger and a significant history of trauma and significant loss. And it wasn't until what I felt is on the surface we were making gains, but I wasn't connected to his heart. And so for me, that's where this journey began, to learn about trauma and to also learn how I, as a caregiver, could connect with his heart and his soul. I always get a little emotional when I tell that story, because this young man is 16 years old today, and we continue to mentor him. He returned home. He lived with us for 2.5 years, returned home to the care of his mother, has since been back living with us at 12 for 6 months, returned home to his mom, and then again in this past year came back to my care at the age of 16. He has a diagnosis, well, not a formal diagnosis of FASD, but what I can tell you is that most people would think that caring for a younger child would certainly be easier than caring for a child in adolescence. And I can tell you that today I'm much better equipped, I'm more knowledgeable, and I've been able to take that knowledge and apply it and become more skilled in using this approach. So parenting my little guy today at 16 was much easier than when I was parenting him at 4, because I didn't have that knowledge. I didn't have that understanding of trauma. And so I speak to, this is why I'm so passionate about the approach, is that I know it works, but I also know it's not just me. Having been able to test this out with our kin, foster, and adoptive parents over the last 2.5 years, I've heard countless stories over and over again from our families that have said, I was ready to give up. I didn't think I could do this anymore. And if it wasn't for TBRI, they still wouldn't be fostering or adopting children, and doing so with a newfound joy and a newfound just sense of connectiveness to the children in their homes. So yeah, I'm just very excited at this point to be a practitioner and to just really share the approach and the model with others, because I know that it works both personally and professionally. And I know that I've trained now just over about 125 homes, and all of the homes have said the same thing. And so that really, just warms my heart, because it really is about just, offering the best service that we can to the families and the children that we work with. Thank you, Olivia.
Thank you so much. Oh, no, thank you. That story was so touching. Thank you for sharing, and thank you for the work you do.
Thank you.
Gail, there is another question in the chat, and also Alicia has her hand raised. So we'll do the question in the chat first, and then Alicia, once that question's answered, if you want to unmute yourself. But I did just want to say to everybody that's still on, if you do have to leave, it's okay. This is being recorded, so once it gets sent out, you will have access to these questions and answers as well. So really quickly, Gail, the question came in from Joya, and it says, is there a piece of TBRI that explores why providing felt safety and connectedness to a child may be difficult for some individuals? I am thinking about intergenerational trauma and parents who grew up without felt safety and unmet needs.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a really great question. And I can say that I'm really interested when the Institute finishes their pilot project and offering this with birth families, because I'm very interested to hear from them and to see what they've discovered in that process. Because we, at Children's Aid, we talk a lot about the fact that most, if not all, of our parents have come from histories of trauma. So what does that look like? The work is very, very different than, let's say, for example, some of the work that I do in my private practice with families that don't, have those histories of harm. And so I can't say enough about the documentary, All Rise for the Good of the Children. So if you'd like to learn more about how that is possible to be, for this to be effective with our families that have experienced trauma, I would really recommend taking a look at that documentary. It really does look at how do we heal these families. And that's the important piece when, we think about, for example, my perspective is from that of Children's Aid Society, right? So we're working with these families and we have a lot of pressure to keep children out of foster care. The reality is that we need all our community partners to come on board. We all need to be, speaking the same language, but also coming from a trauma-informed approach in order to benefit our children and our families. And so we know that our families need to be healed. And so that means our families are going to be seeking out services in the community, whether it be for themselves, hopefully, but also for their children. And these services need to be trauma informed and need to come from a place of compassion. But certainly that's where it becomes really complex, is these parents have to heal from their own histories. And that it's their journey. It's something that just doesn't happen overnight, but happens with a lot of time and support and compassion from all of us. And I'm just a firm believer that we all have to wrap around and provide, trauma-informed care to these families, because they didn't ask for these histories either. But certainly now that we understand how their brain has been wired differently, we can certainly help them in a way that is compassionate and without judgment and without shame and without all of these things that sometimes can happen just because of the systems in which we work in. So I really hope if you can check out that documentary, it will show you how an entire county in the state of Texas was able, starting with the child welfare system and the court system, came together and wrapped around these families who were struggling. And these are families with addiction and mental health and a whole host of challenges. And all of these providers came together, were all trained in TBRI, and helped these families. And so it does, I believe the documentary shows 2 to 3 families and their entire journey to healing, and how these parents were able to actually regain custody of their children, and what that looks like in a 2-3 year period of everybody working together. I'm by no means going to sit here and say that this is easy work. It's probably the most challenging work out there, is working with family and children that have histories of trauma. But certainly it is, just so gratifying when you see that the outcomes can be different. When I see my 16-year-old, who is, I'm essentially co-parenting with mom. He knows we're his soft place to land. So whenever there's issues, they know he can come back here. But when I see him with his history, and knowing now that, mom has admittedly drank throughout pregnancy, and knowing that these are some of the challenges he deals with, and yet with the support and using this TBRI approach, this is a young man who is thriving, COVID aside, because that's been a challenge for everyone, he is able to thrive with the right approach and the right supports. And so it really, this is why I believe in the approach so much. I will also say that I have a number of therapeutic foster parents that I've worked with that have much more experience than I do in the trenches, 30, 35, 40 years of experience. And one of them was my co-trainer as I was delivering some of this training to our foster adoptive parents. And she cares for children with significant developmental delays, as well as children with autism. And she herself was amazed at how well this approach works with children of all different learning needs, developmental needs, and histories of trauma. So it was just, it's important for me to hear from others who are using the approach too, so that it's not just my personal experience, but what others have experienced. So it's always, just very helpful to hear from others. So
Gail, the last question is from Alicia. And Alicia, if you would like to unmute, you can ask your question.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, Alicia.
Hi, I'm currently going into my 3rd year of social work at the University of Windsor. So I'm just sort of trying to take in all the information as I can right now. I kind of like to go by the philosophy, when we know better, we can do and be better. So I Currently am reading The Body Keeps the Score right now, and just finished Attached, because it's clear that trauma and attachment styles really affect individuals and are the root of a lot of issues that we face with ourselves and families and society. And I like when in The Body Keeps the Score, they mention how trauma is the hidden epidemic. Yeah, so I was wondering if you had any other recommendations of books or other resources.
I have many.
Yes, I figured.
So here's my copy of The Body Keeps the Score.
Yes.
And as you can see, it is like my go-to.
Yes.
I also really love The Whole Brain Child by Dr. Dan Siegel and Tina Payne Grayson. Real go-to working with children and parents. I work in my private practice. I work very closely with, I actually only accept referrals of children if the parents are willing to work alongside me. And so it's really, really important for me. And so I use that book a lot. The Yes Brain as well by Dr. Dan Siegel, great resource. The Connected Child by Dr. Karen Purvis again. And there is also they've now released The Connected Parent. And so I'm excited to read that. I'm actually picking that up at Chapters tomorrow. Right. Any work by Dr. Bruce Perry, phenomenal. And, Dr. Gabor Madi, though he's not specific to working with children, I'm currently doing a self-led trauma series called The Wisdom of Trauma with him, and I'm enjoying that quite a bit. But there's, all of these pioneers, all of these experts in the field, everything, relates. And every time I read a new resource, I take what I can in both my work at Children's Aid, but also my private practice, as well as a caregiver, to just incorporate it. It can be really overwhelming. And so what I always suggest is kind of taking 3 or 4 things and integrating it into our practice, because I find that if you're anything like me, it really, it does take time. So knowledge really doesn't equate skill acquisition. So you've got to take the knowledge and then you have to integrate it. And so one of the things with TBRI at Children's Aid is we're going to look at a very clear plan on how we roll this out to our staff, so that we can make sure that we support them in their learning as well. And that we do this in a way where there's lots of consultations and lots of practice and lots of training and refresher training, because as adult learners, we're never going to be able to integrate everything right away, and it does take time. So what I also will say, Alicia, is I'm really excited that you're actually read the book as a third-year student, because in the university curriculum, they really don't cover much in terms of trauma. My daughter just graduated this past year with her BSW, and everything that she's learned about trauma really has been self-led or from myself. And so I was a bit disappointed to learn that there's not much in the curriculum that really speaks about trauma in any kind of deep way. So I'm happy to hear that you're doing your own work that will really serve you well in the field.
Yes, I have a family member that actually is a MSW, and she uses the book a lot for everything. And luckily, she's been able to guide me with all of that and sort of tell me that the trauma isn't really taught all that much in the curriculum, and to really focus on it, because it's really, again, it's like the foundation of all epidemics almost, right?
Well, it's really interesting. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Beacon House, but if you ever have some time to go on Beacon House, and they have so many resources that I use both at Children's Aid and in my private practice. And one of the handouts on their website, talks about what if, all of these diagnoses that we give children really is unresolved trauma. Mm-hmm. And, there's lots of research that supports that. So, and what if it was just really a survival strategy behind the label? And mm-hmm. So we know that, and that's why it's so complex, is that you know, children develop so differently based on their life experiences, and all of those life experiences will, as practitioners or as caregivers, we're never going to know everything that's happened to a child and at what stage of development. And so it's challenging, which is I think part of why I love the work so much, but at the same time, very humbling, because I always say I have so much more to learn, and I just keep learning and keep reading. If any, the other thing I will say before we wrap up today is the book, The Out of Sync Child, is a great book if you're caring or working with children with sensory issues. The area of sensory needs is really an area where I've learned a lot in the last couple of years, and I really plan on doing a lot more learning and working with some occupational therapists that you know, certainly have a better understanding of what that means and how they can be of assistance in working with some of our children. But sensory needs is another key piece of the TBRI model that most other models do not encompass. So I believe it's Carol Kranowitz that is the author of The Out of Sync Child. If you ever have a chance to take a look at that book, it's wonderful.
Well, I have all these books written down, so thank you so much. I'll definitely take a trip to Indigo.
Thanks, Alicia. Thanks for your question and for being here today.
Thank you.
So that looks like all the questions that are out there. So Kira, I'm not sure if you have an outro, but really quickly, Gail, that was awesome. Thank you so much for everything. I will be reaching out just to clarify the resources that you did state. I did drop them in the chat, but I just want to make sure that you and I are touching base to make sure that they're correct. But that was wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. It was greatly appreciated. And you have received quite a lot of thanks and gratitude in the chat. So I wanted to make sure I pass that along to you as well. I look forward to future endeavors, and thank you so much for today.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks for everything. And if anybody has, you know, any other questions, I did want to say, but maybe we can put that out with the video, is they can also visit the the Karen Purvis Institute, www. I want to say it's child.edu.tcu. But they have a ton of resources on their website, and so certainly valuable if people are interested in taking a peek.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Gail.
Okay, thank you so much. Bye.
Have a great day.
You too.